In March 1972, North Vietnam launched a new offensive in the south. Nixon responded with more air attacks. Would the Soviets receive Nixon in Moscow while his planes were bombing their North Vietnamese ally?
The general debate that took place in the White House Situation Room, and I was in many of these, was which is more important, the Vietnam front or the Moscow front? And Nixon was the only important person that I can recall who said we can have both. I'm willing to lose the Moscow summit, but I predict the Russians will go ahead even if we bomb Hanoi and mine Haiphong.
Nixon and Henry Kissinger played sort of good cop, bad cop with the Russians particularly. Kissinger would see Anatoly Dobrynin, the Russian ambassador, frequently, I mean, almost daily. And his line was, look, I work for this crazy man. There's no telling what he might do. So Anatoly, you and I, as reasonable men, must work together to an accommodation between our countries.
Kissinger was uncertain whether Moscow would allow the summit to go ahead.
I went to see Kissinger. He was nervous but tried to hide it. He said jokingly, "Okay, let's have a bet," because he knew I had a piece of paper with the official Soviet reply. He said, "Let's bet whether I can guess the answer." So we bet a crate of champagne. I asked him, "So what do you think the Soviet answer is?" He was convinced that the summit had been postponed to a later date. In fact, the official Soviet reply was, "The summit is going ahead, as planned."
May 22nd, 1972. Richard Nixon became the first serving American president to be received in the Kremlin. The summit reached agreements to limit offensive and defensive nuclear weapons, and it laid the foundation of Detente. For Brezhnev and Nixon, this was the most dramatic proof yet of the new relationship between their two countries. But first, the Soviets had to make their point on Vietnam.
President Nixon, Dr. Kissinger, myself, and one other officer, four of us, went out to Brezhnev's country dacha. And there we saw Brezhnev, Kosygin, Podgorny, and the National Security Advisor on their side, 4 and 4. We sat for 3 hours in a dacha in which each of the Russian leaders took an hour to blast the United States for its Vietnam policy, absolutely attacking Nixon and the United States. Nixon knew what they were doing, namely they were writing a transcript to send to Hanoi. So he listened patiently, didn't get overly argumentative, basically just took it. After 3.5 hours of the Soviet diatribe, sort of a tag team match among the Soviet leaders, we then went upstairs for dinner, and the entire mood changed. Brezhnev broke out the vodka. There was singing and jokes and toasts. And then later that evening, Kissinger went back, I believe with Gromyko, and did some more negotiating on arms control.
The atmosphere was very good, even friendly. We were quite aggressive in view of Nixon's actions on Vietnam, but we made sure it didn't overshadow the summit, because the issues that Nixon was going to raise had already been agreed through the confidential channel. These were very important nuclear issues. All the members of the Politburo knew that the text of the treaty had already been agreed. Nixon knew that too from Kissinger. So, if we gave in to our emotions, we would ruin everything that had already been achieved.
The President of the United States.
The American Congress gave Nixon a hero's welcome.
last Friday in Moscow, we witnessed the beginning of the end of that era, which began in 1945. We took the first step toward a new era of mutually agreed restraint and arms limitation between the two principal nuclear powers. With this step, we have enhanced the security of both nations. We have begun to check the wasteful and dangerous spiral of nuclear arms, which has dominated relations between our two countries for a generation. We have begun to reduce the level of fear by reducing the causes of fear for our two peoples and for all peoples in the world.
2 weeks after Nixon's return from Moscow, 5 men working for his re-election campaign were arrested for breaking into the Washington headquarters of the Democratic Party. It was the start of a major scandal, Watergate. As Election Day approached, Kissinger returned from one of his many negotiating rounds with the North Vietnamese. He told Nixon he at last had a deal on Vietnam.
The North Vietnamese negotiator, Le Duc Tho, presented to Dr. Kissinger a draft agreement on restoring peace and ending the war in Vietnam. And the first thing he said when he presented that document to Dr. Kissinger was, "You are in a hurry, are you not?" And I recall Dr. Kissinger nodding affirmatively when Le Duc Tho made that statement.
We knew that Kissinger had met with the North Vietnamese side in Paris on October 9. So when he came on October 19 and gave us the text in English, mind you, and he asked us to say, well, we got 4 days to sign. And of course, we politely said, well, you know, this is the first time we have been given this text, so we would like to have time to study it. But by the way, you know, where is the Vietnamese text?
When I see the widows, the orphans, when I see so many tombs, so many sacrifices for the freedom and liberty of Vietnam, I reaffirm again that the whole people of South Vietnam will resist again any peace which demand the rendition of South Vietnam and which will give the South Vietnam to the communist aggressors.
I have great sympathy for Thieu. And at the same time, I have great sympathy for our problem. We faced 65 congressional resolutions in the year 1972 alone that were urging unilateral withdrawal from Vietnam.
And Mr. Kissinger said, well, if you sign this, we're going to bring peace, and it will be, South Vietnam will be developed, people will be happy, at which President Thieu said, listen, you know, we have the interest and the future of our country. We are not looking for Nobel Prize.
South Vietnam refused to sign. With his deal facing collapse, Kissinger hastily reassured Hanoi America still wanted an agreement.
We believe that peace is at hand. We believe that an agreement is within sight. It is inevitable that in a war of such complexity, that there should be occasional difficulties in reaching a final solution.
This latest setback in the Vietnam peace talks did not damage Nixon. He was easily re-elected for a second term. Back in Paris, Kissinger had to put Thieu's objections to the North Vietnamese.
How do I get out of here?
We thought you weren't having a meeting today, sir.
Well, do something surprising.
It's getting to be difficult to have a secret rendezvous in Paris.
It certainly is.
Will you be meeting again tomorrow, sir?
We expect to, yes.
One day we were on the verge of finalizing the text. The next day there were suddenly 10 or 12 different issues that popped up and were unresolved. And then Le Duc Tho said that he had to go back to Hanoi for consultations.
Le Ducteau left Paris and the talks broke down. Nixon ordered air raids on North Vietnam, hoping to bludgeon Hanoi into agreement and at the same time bolster the South. Over 12 days, Hanoi and Haiphong came under the most sustained bombing campaign of the war. The bombing served its purpose. North and South Vietnam were ready to agree to the deal that Kissinger put together. Under the peace accords, American troops would leave Vietnam, the Saigon government would remain in power, but North Vietnam's troops would stay in the South. Nixon called it peace with honor.
It so happened that with Mr. Kissinger, who had wanted to play the triangular to do the detente, and Vietnam had to go in order for detente to happen. So this is my own analysis, and then that, unfortunately, was not very good for the South Vietnamese people.
Good evening. The biggest White House scandal in a century, the Watergate scandal, broke wide open today. The Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, has resigned because, in his own words, he had close personal and professional associations with people who may have broken the law. The two closest men to the president, H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, and John Ehrlichman, his chief domestic advisor, have resigned. Last week, both men were fighting hard to keep their jobs.
We had a great staff system in the White House for dealing with crises. We didn't apply that system to Watergate. I think part of the reason was we didn't consider it a crisis. It was a very